Zaki Hassan is your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Breaking news in the world of Hollywood. An American icon has passed away. Marvel Comics co-creator Stan Lee.
The Fantastic Four, the Incredible Hulk, the Amazing Spider-Man, not to mention the X-Men, the Avengers, and Black Panther.
The singular mind and heart behind the comics and ideas that shape countless American childhoods.
Stan Lee created a comic book universe that was true to its brand name, a Marvel.
All I was doing was trying to just make a living, do these things. And then I got to enjoy writing them, so all I was doing was having fun.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Nostalgia Theater, and this is a break from the normal way I approach this show in terms of the subject matter, but this is November 12th, 2018, and we are recording this on the day that a legend has left us. And maybe the word legend is too small to encapsulate everything this man has accomplished. I'm talking about Stan Lee, the ambassador of comicdom to the world. He created so many characters. I'm not even going to bother listing every character that he created because that'll eat up our time. But he is gone, and that's news that, I mean, let's be honest, it's something that most of us were expecting over, certainly the last 10 years once he was in his late 80s, but that didn't make the gut punch of actually seeing it realized any less heartbreaking. And so I'm here to have kind of an Irish wake, to remember the man, to examine his life, to examine his legacy, and I'm here with my frequent co-host on this show and somebody who I think is perfectly equipped to have this conversation with me. Glenn Greenberg is back.
Yes, your fellow Irishman. For this Irish wake.
the Muslim and the Jewish guy. We're going to do the Irish wake. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, I've been thinking about this actually since morning because, the last couple of years have really seen so many of the icons of our collective childhoods leave us one by one. And for me, it's almost like when Leonard Nimoy died in 2015, that was that was one of the first ones that really hit me. And then, we had Adam West last year, and just this year, we Harlan Ellison and Steve Ditko and
Yep.
now Stan. To paraphrase Thanos, 2018 extracts a heavy toll.
Mm-hmm. It's tough. It's. I've been thinking a lot about all the others whose deaths are going to happen, sooner rather than later, and going to hit me. And certainly William Shatner is one.
Absolutely.
Paul and Ringo are others. Hopefully they'll be around for many years to come, but you never know. And Stan is one that I can't say it was unexpected, but you wanted to know that he was there. You wanted to know that he was going to be there for a while longer. I mean, obviously at 95, every day, every extra day is a blessing. But you never wanted this day to happen. It's funny because Roy Thomas on Facebook posted he visited Stan 48 hours before he died.
No kidding.
And you see these pictures of Roy Thomas and Stan together, and presumably these are the last photographs ever taken of Stan. And he looks old, but he looks content. He looks healthy for a 95-year-old man. There's no appearance of somebody who's going to be gone 48 hours later.
Wow. And folks, for those of you listening who maybe don't know who Roy Thomas is, he's one of the most important figures in comic book history. Certainly in Marvel history, he was the first editor-in-chief after Stan Lee. And he has a list of credits as long as your arm. He, of course, is responsible for Conan the Barbarian coming to comics, and that's a legacy that continues right up to this very day. So even if Conan the Barbarian...
Star Wars.
Oh, and Star Wars, exactly. There you go. Look at that.
Yep.
You know, if those are like the only two things credited to Roy Thomas, he's still one of the he's on the Mount Rushmore of comic books.
Right.
But now you were, of course, an editor at Marvel in the 90s, and you went from fan to pro, and you got to meet the man himself. I mean, talk about that. Talk about the first time you met Stan Lee.
The first time I met Stan, I was in college, and I was the comics coordinator for a science fiction, a fantasy, and science fact convention at my university, which was Stony Brook University in Stony Brook, New York. And I was the comics coordinator that year. It was April 19th to the 21st, 1991, and I asked Stan to be my comics guest of honor. In fact, it was through Harlan Ellison that I got through to Stan, because I didn't have any contact information for Stan. And Harlan, Harlan, who I didn't know from Adam, I was on the phone with him, and he was like, "You didn't get this from me," and Greenberg, and he gave me Stan's home number, and I called him, and so Stan came out, and he was fantastic. He was our comics guest of honor that year, and he was wonderful, and so that's how I met him. And I hosted a panel. I hosted his panel. He did a Q&A with the audience, and I put together this panel of Harlan, Stan, and DC Comics, legendary DC Comics editor Julie Schwartz. The three of them together. It was standing room only. It was the highlight of the whole convention. It was
the
incredible.
Three giants, all of whom are gone now.
Yes, yeah. Harlan obviously left us earlier this year, so when I ended up at Marvel in July of '92. So I was in my early 20s, and Stan would come to the office every now and then. And so this was very early on in my tenure there at Marvel on staff. So Stan was visiting from California. He's walking through the offices and saying hello, and I went up to him and I said, "Mr. Lee, you don't remember me, but Glenn Greenberg, you came to Icon a couple of years ago. I just wanted to say, meeting you was one of the real highlights of my life." And he shook my hand and he said, "Well, thank you. That's very nice of you to say, and I'm sorry you've had such a boring, uneventful life."
That's such a Stan thing, right?
So, this is a guy who, listen, Stan had a very healthy ego, and he loved attention, and he loved, praise and all that. But he was also capable of self-deprecating humor.
Yeah.
And I loved that about him. So those were the first couple of times I met him. And I'd meet him whenever he'd come to the Marvel picnics and the Marvel holiday parties. I have a bunch of pictures that I took with him, which I hope to be posting in the very near future on my blog and elsewhere. And so we'd bump into each other. And then later on in my tenure at Marvel, once we went into the bankruptcy and we were having really bad financial problems and all that, Stan wanted to get involved again. And so he wanted to revive the column that he used to write when he was in New York and at the center of, the whole comic book part of the business. He used to write a column called Stan's Soapbox, and it used to appear on the Bullpen Bulletins page, which was, the Marvel basically was a newsletter, and we would promote new and upcoming projects and marriage announcements and birth announcements and all that kind of fun stuff. So Stan wanted to revive Stan's Soapbox, and I was the editor of the Bullpen Bulletins page at that point. I kind of inherited it from I guess after Mark Grunewald passed away.
I see. Okay.
Mark was overseeing the Bullpen Bulletins page. Just for those of you who don't know, another legendary editor, Mark Grunewald, who was the executive editor and the continuity cop at Marvel. Just a wonderful guy. He died, I think it was August 12th, 1996.
And that was very sudden.
Yes, he woke up on a Monday morning and had a massive heart attack, massive heart failure, and just pretty much died instantly. And that was a devastating blow.
It's bananas when you say that he's been gone for 22 years at this point. I can't even process that.
Well, think how I feel.
Yeah, seriously, yeah, absolutely.
He was one of my mentors.
Wow.
And certainly an on-site mentor instead of Stan, who was more of a spiritual mentor. But anyway, so I took over editing the Bullpen Bulletins page, and Stan wanted to revive the soapbox, and so I worked with him on that. And Stan's idea this time around, instead of him writing columns where he would tackle a lot of heady issues back in the 60s and 70s, he wrote this very famous treatise against bigotry and prejudice, and he would write
which has gone viral now in the last several hours. Yeah.
Absolutely, and he wrote. He would write whatever moved him. Anything that was on his mind. This time, he wanted it to become a Q&A.
Right.
And
I remember this.
So, yeah. So Stan put the word out that he wanted people to send in questions, and he'd write the answers. And so I received all the questions. He basically made my job that much more complex. But no, it was fine. It was fine. I selected the questions.
Okay.
And so I would send the questions to Stan, and then Stan would write the answers. And sometimes he would call me with to fact check something, or I would call him to say, Stan, I don't think that's right. Maybe it's this, and sort of go back and forth with him on that kind of stuff. So that was a lot of fun. That was my way of being in touch with Stan on a regular basis. Other things, and Stan, actually, I can say that I commissioned Stan to write a story for me, and that I helped edit it. This was in the wake of Aunt May's death in The Amazing Spider-Man. We did a storyline where Aunt May apparently died. She died supposedly in Amazing Spider-Man number 400. And we cleared this with Stan. We gave Stan a heads up that we were doing this, and he gave us his blessing. And so in the aftermath of that, I asked Stan to write a short story as a backup for one of the Spider-Man annuals or a special edition, one of those double-sized jobs. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember if we gave him the idea or if he came up with it. But no matter what, he did a story about Peter and Mary Jane mourning the loss of Aunt May and them visiting her grave. And I don't remember the particulars of the story, but what I do remember is I guess it was an 8 or 10 page story, penciled by Derek Robertson, who was a buddy of mine, inked by George Perez.
Wow.
And Stan wrote the plot, and Stan, the art came in, and Stan wrote the script. It left a lump in my throat. It was such a beautiful story that, of course, was later undone when it was revealed that Aunt May wasn't dead. But that's neither here nor there. At the time, it very much appeared that she was dead. But he wrote this beautiful, heartfelt story. It was really, really wonderful. And he loved the art. He loved Derek's job, the penciling job that Derek did. In fact, he was looking for a project that he could do with Derek. He was so excited about the job that Derek did. And, of course, with George Perez inking it, it was, it looked beautiful. Just a beautiful meshing. And he wanted to work with George, too, on something. So he was, really excited about it. And he wrote this handwritten note to me that about how much he just loved the way it all worked out. And getting a handwritten note from Stan, that's like getting a nod of approval from God. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It really just was such a. I still have it somewhere. It's in my files somewhere. It was a thrill. And
this, folks,
again,
if you mentioned you weren't entirely sure, I couldn't remember what it's from. It's from Spectacular Spider-Man Super Special #1 from September '95. So if anybody listening is interested in seeking that out, I'm fairly certain that's available digitally.
I'm sure it is, and it really was a very beautiful story. And it was just so great to do that with Stan. And then fast forward a little after that, Marvel and DC had started doing the crossover specials again. Those special edition crossovers where a Marvel character teams up with a DC character and so forth and so on. And I wanted to do The Incredible Hulk versus Superman. And I wanted Steve Rude to draw it. And I figured who would be the ideal person that DC would just sign off on in a heartbeat, because both companies have to sign off on the creative teams.
Right.
And again, I don't remember how this all came together. It might have been suggested to me by my boss, Tom Brevoort. I don't remember. But my pitch was The Incredible Hulk versus Superman by Stan Lee and Steve Rude. And Stan signed on. And Steve Rude, because Steve Rude never wanted to work for Marvel. He considered Marvel to be the great white Satan. We screwed over Jack Kirby, and so he never wanted to work for Marvel. But I established a relationship with Steve. And I would call him every now and then to offer him work. He'd always politely turn me down, but I was working him. I was working him slowly but surely because I wanted to get him to do stuff for us. And so finally, once Stan agreed to do it, I called Steve and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Glenn, I swore I would never, ever work for Marvel. But but this is the project that this is the thing that's going to make me change that position." And so I remember the idea was for Stan to plot it and script it. So we would do it the Marvel style, which was the writer writes a very tight synopsis. Or a loose synopsis, whatever the artist is more comfortable with. But write a synopsis, a page-by-page breakdown of the story. The artist then goes off and draws it. And then once the art is done, the writer then goes in and writes all the dialogue and the captions and does all that based on the art. And so I do remember there was like a 2-hour gab fest that I had with Stan, where I had my feet up on my desk. And Stan and I are talking, and we were going to basically come up with the overall concept for this project. What I remember is one of the things that I pitched to him is I said, "Stan, why don't we set this in the early days of both characters?" So, for example, it's the early days of the Hulk where he's still talking somewhat normally, almost more like the Thing than the Hulk. Where he's doing full sentences and is speaking about himself as I rather than Hulk,
Yeah.
And I said, and the other key thing, Stan, is back in those days, nobody knew that Bruce Banner was the Hulk. The Hulk was had a secret identity, and this we can really play with that, like Clark Kent and Superman, Bruce Banner and the Hulk, and we could play with the whole concept that they both have these secret identities that they have to hide. And he said to me, he goes, he said, "It was great when the world didn't know that Bruce Banner was the Hulk. That's the way it worked the best. Why the hell did they change that?" And I didn't have the heart to tell him that it was Stan was the one who did that story. And I was just like, "I don't know, Stan. I really, boy, you got to wonder what was going through people's heads back then." Yeah. And it was like, all right, let's move along. Let's just move along. But it was great. And he was telling me stories about the old days, and we were just going back and forth and coming up with ideas and so forth. And I said, Luthor can be the villain, and I said, we'd have to think about who the Hulk villain would be and all that. And I just remember we were wrapping up after about 2 hours, and I'm like pinching myself. I just had a 2-hour plot session with Stan Lee, and as we're wrapping up, I said, "Stan, this was an incredible pleasure and an honor." And he goes, "Great talking to you, Gary." It's like, All right, well, that kind of let the air a little bit out of the balloon, but what the hell?
Yeah, I'll take it.
2 hours with Stan, I'll take it. Yeah. But those are like some of the fondest memories that I have. And obviously, if you know, for the comic book fans out there who follow this kind of stuff, Stan ended up not doing the Hulk Superman book. But the fact of the matter is, it's because of Stan that I got Steve Rude to do it. And even though Stan dropped out, and I really thought that was going to be the end of the project, I was pretty much ready to just consider it a dead issue. Mm-hmm. Steve Rude is the one who kept it alive. And
really?
Steve kept pushing me to keep it going. And ultimately, I bit the bullet, and I was like, okay, this isn't going to turn out the way that I wanted to. But if there's anybody other than Stan who could really make this thing sing, it's going to be Roger Stern. And Roger signed on, and the rest is history. The book came out. I consider it, the closest thing I ever came to editing a true masterpiece.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, no small thing having somebody like Roger Stern. Like, if you can't get Stan, Roger Stern is a very good, second choice.
Yeah. I mean, there was actually talk at one point. I think between me and Stan, of having Roger plot it, because I knew that DC would approve of Roger, of having Roger plot it, and then Stan would come in and script it, so that Stan would still be involved. Ultimately, I didn't go with that. I made the editorial decision that it wouldn't be fair to Roger, because having Roger write the plot, the real icing on the cake is being able to script it. And I didn't want to take that away from Roger. So it never got to that point. I think I might have broached the subject with Roger, but it was more like, well, I mean, this idea was floating, but you don't really want to do that, do you? And he was like, no. I was like, okay, good enough. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think at this point it's talking out of school. But yeah, I didn't feel that it would have been fair to Roger to once the artwork came in, say, okay, well, you're done. Stan, it's all yours.
Right.
I wanted Roger to do the whole job, and he did a terrific job. But Steve kept it alive, and the reason why he signed on in the first place was to work with Stan.
And that book, again, for folks, if you're interested in seeking that out, it is The Incredible Hulk versus Superman. The back issue is a little bit harder to find these days. I know it goes for upwards of $20 in some places, but it's a great book. I have you know this, Glenn, I have a bound set of Superman going from 1986 to 2006. And so all there was a substantial amount of like intercompany crossover Superman was a part of. So I have, in my 1999 volume, I've got the Incredible Hulk versus Superman tucked right in there. So
that's part of your Superman collection?
Yeah, got it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so it is preserved, at least on my bookshelf, forever and always.
Oh, that's terrific. I'm really glad to hear that. And yeah, we did keep the concept of setting it in the early days of both characters. That was a carryover from when the project was going to be written by Stan.
Yeah, and obviously Rude's art, Steve Rude, is known for a style that's heavily evocative of Jack Kirby. So it almost works like a hidden chapter in those first 6 issues of Incredible Hulk that, of course, Stan Lee wrote.
Yeah, it was great.
Now getting back to Stan, obviously you had the opportunity to work firsthand with him, got to interact with him to a much greater degree than obviously a lot of fans have been able to. I mean, it's astonishing when you look at how many. I mean, I'm just looking at social media. How many people have their like convention posed pictures with Stan Lee? And I'm looking at him, and as recently as just earlier this year, he was at Silicon Valley Comic-Con. 95 years old, and he's signing autographs, taking pictures. There have been obviously a lot of stories about how he may have been unwilling or sort of being pushed into doing this stuff at the tail end. I know, I'm just speaking from my own experience. I was at the Comic-Con as press, and I had my boys with me, and they're like, "We want to meet Stan Lee. We want to meet Stan Lee." And I told them, "Boys, let's leave Stan Lee alone."
Right.
And part of that I felt like he shouldn't be doing this. That was my thing. I was like, Stan Lee doesn't owe us anything anymore.
Right.
And we've seen so many of these stories over the last several months that are certainly heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think anything should take away from the scope of the man's accomplishment. So maybe we can go back in time a little bit and let's talk about that because obviously he is a legend, but he's also a legend that's draped in a certain amount of controversy, at least in certain quarters, because the Marvel Universe did not spring from his mind entirely. He worked very fruitfully with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, and of course many, many others. And this has been like the ongoing conversation. Well, Stan gets too much credit, or Jack is trying to take credit for things he didn't do, and all. And I look at it, I'm like, this is like trying to say that Lennon deserves more credit than McCartney, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I look at it. I'm like, this is what happened. The Marvel Universe was a true creative collaboration. If you remove Stan from the mix, it isn't what it is. If you remove Jack from the mix, it isn't what it is. If you remove Steve Ditko, it needed all of these people to bring their specific ingredients. That's my take. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, my thoughts are, and the Lennon-McCartney comparison, I think is pretty fair. What really ticks me off is when people compare him to Bob Kane.
Oh, sure, yeah,
the creator of Batman, who from 99.9% of the accounts really was
the biggest Batman villain of all time.
Well, let's just say he was not a mensch, okay?
There you go.
And was really, let's say, stingy when it came to passing the credit around where credit was due. Whereas Stan, for one thing, Stan is the one who introduced the whole concept of putting credits in the comics so that you knew who did what, who the artists were. That was Stan. Stan. Now, the thing that sort of gets forgotten in all this is, sure, Stan was the writer. He was the head writer. He was the main writer. He was also the editor. He was also the art director. And if he was home writing all day and basically doing what he was doing, which was letting the really good artists come up with the plots and letting them sort of dictate where the storylines go, and then he would come in, and add the dialogue later. If that's all he was doing, I can understand, a lot of the vitriol, against him. But the fact of the matter is, he was in the office. He was overseeing the whole company. He was coming up with who's going to do what book. He was art directing the covers, art directing the pages as they came in, because he had no qualms about having the art corrected if he didn't feel it was working right. It takes up a lot of your time, not to mention the fact that he was the editor-in-chief. He didn't have the title of editor-in-chief, but he was functioning as the editor-in-chief. Every Marvel comic that came out during that time, when he was effectively running the company, he had the final word on those comics because, number one, he wrote the scripts, and number two, he was the editor, so he had final say over the artwork as well. So he had just as much say, and he had final say on all of those books. So he had as much say as any of the artists. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, if you want to diminish his abilities as a writer, which I disagree with, because I think he was a terrific writer. I think he was one of the best writers. If you want to attack, his contributions as a writer, you'll have to take me on, fist to fist, if you want to challenge his abilities as an editor. He may well be the greatest editor that the comic book industry has ever had, and ever will have. There is nobody better than Stan Lee. I mean, maybe Archie Goodwin comes really close.
Well, let's expand on that a little bit. And you've got the professional background. You know of what you speak. So why is Stan the greatest editor of all time?
Okay, Stan knew Stan cast the books the way you would cast the movie.
Nice.
Jack Kirby was originally supposed to do Spider-Man.
Right.
He didn't like the way Jack was drawing Spider-Man. I think Jack drew a few pages of the first appearance of Spider-Man. I guess that would have been Amazing Fantasy 15. And he just didn't like the way Jack was doing it. He felt he wanted Spider-Man to be that gangly sort of, skinny little teenager that Peter Parker was. And Jack wasn't giving that to him. So he put Jack on something else, and he brought in Steve Ditko. That's basically casting.
Yeah,
okay?
Right.
I think it worked out. I think his foresight on that, really sort of worked out for the best. So he knew how to put the right artists on the right books. He had an eye for talent, for damn sure. I mean, Stan is the guy who brought in Roy Thomas. Roy Thomas, fast forward about 10, 15 years, Roy Thomas saved Marvel by bringing in Star Wars, like what I told you.
Yeah.
A few years earlier, Roy had the vision to bring Conan the Barbarian to comics.
Yeah.
I think that went pretty well as well. So he had a real eye for talent. He was open to bringing in, other artists. I mean, you just look at the even the later artists who came in. Of course, he started with Kirby. He started with Ditko, Larry Lieber, his brother, Don Heck, and then later on, you see, he brought in John Buscema, John Romita. He had the vision to put John Romita on Spider-Man after Ditko left. I mean, my understanding, because I wasn't born yet, but my understanding was there was a real panic around the office. Ditko's leaving. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Who can replace Ditko? And Stan, basically brought John Romita on and said, you're going to replace Steve Ditko. John Romita never felt like he was the permanent guy on Spider-Man. He always was waiting for Ditko to come back. And I don't think Stan ever felt that way. I think that he felt Ditko's gone, Romita's going to take over. And the fact of the matter is, not only did sales increase when Romita took over Spider-Man, but Romita's Spider-Man became the
iconic Spider-Man. Yeah.
The iconic Spider-Man, more so than Ditko. Now, don't get me wrong. I think Ditko was a genius. I think Ditko's Spider-Man is brilliant. But as a kid, if I had to choose one or the other, I absolutely every time would have chose
no doubt.
John Romita.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what you're saying is exactly right. I mean, certainly for me growing up in the 80s, my primary exposure to Spider-Man came via the Amazing Friends cartoon show and the syndicated cartoon show, in the early part of the 80s. And those were basically, modeled directly on the way John Romita drew Peter Parker, the way John Romita drew Spider-Man.
Right.
All the model sheets and everything, and all the merchandising art. I mean, it's hard for, especially kids these days, and here I am saying kids these days, right? But in the late 80s, McFarlane came in and sort of fundamentally just shattered the paradigm of how Spider-Man is quote unquote supposed to look, with the the arms all akimbo and doing all that, and the spaghetti webbing and stuff. But and I think his impact is still being felt to this day. But before McFarlane, it was John Romita's Spider-Man.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I kind of lament the fact that that version eventually kind of faded into the background a little bit. But that was Stan. Stan had the vision to get Neil Adams to come over to Marvel. He saw what Neil was doing at I guess I'm trying to think about the time, was if Neil was doing Batman yet. I'm not 100% sure, but he saw that.
Well, let's see. Like his X-Men run was like the late '60s, right?
Right.
So
right.
Batman is probably the early part of the '70s.
'69, I think he started doing Brave and the Bold.
Okay, so the X-Men might have predated that then. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then that takes even more vision than I initially thought, because Neil wasn't really Neil yet. Until he was doing Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and Batman. And so he brought Neil Adams over and Barry Smith and all these guys who eventually came in. We have Stan to thank for that, because Stan had final say for a really long time, going well into the 70s. If there was something he didn't like, he made it known, and so not so much that he blackballed artists from not working for the company again, but he certainly contributed to making their work better.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, like I said, John Buscema, I mean, he brought John Buscema in. John Buscema is, he's right up there. He's on the Mount Rushmore.
He's on that Mount Rushmore,
of comics. Yeah. Well, that was because of Stan, and Stan put him on the Silver Surfer.
Right.
Much to Jack Kirby's chagrin, but
yeah, right.
He had a vision. And it takes a great editor to do that. To be able to cast these books correctly. I remember being in college and feeling that Marvel, to some extent, had lost its way. And I said, they got to do what Stan did. Cast the books. Cast them like they're, Hollywood movies. You want the right people for the right part. To put the right people on the right books. And you have to look at Marvel's output at the time. And I'm talking even beyond, the books that he was working on. He was just putting the right people on the right books. It takes a great editor to do that. It takes a great editor to know when to step in and when to step aside and let your creative teams do their best work. And Stan certainly did that.
And taking another step back in time, even before the Marvel machine had really taken off. I mean, I think the foresight that was demonstrated. These days, right? When we talk about Marvel Studios, a lot of in the media scuttlebutt, you say Marvel Studios is a brand like Pixar is a brand, right? Mm-hmm. And by that, people say, it's something where people know it, they know what to expect. It's 4 quadrants, and I often say, well, Marvel Comics was Pixar before Marvel Studios was Pixar, mm-hmm. in the sense that what happened in the early part of the 60s was a fundamental paradigm shift in how the people making the comics expected those comics to be perceived. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's pretty much directly as a result of Stan Lee saying, well, I don't want to write disposable shit. Right?
He may have used those very words.
Without putting too fine a point on it, I mean, that's what it came down to, right?
Well, it's funny because I was thinking back, and by the time I was reading comics, Stan was a few years removed from being the main writer at Marvel.
Right.
So all the stuff that I was reading by him was in the form of reprints or old issues that my brother had stashed in his closet or whatever, And I would also have a lot of reprints of the old DC comics, the old DC Supermans and Batmans, collected in hardcover books or the 100-page magazines where they would reprint old stories. And what I found was in the 50s and I guess going well into the 60s too, what hooked me on the DC comics, the Superman, Batmans, the world's finest, where Superman and Batman team up and all that. What hooked me on those stories was the plot, the main concept. Oh, Superman and Batman travel back in time to the Revolutionary days, and Superman ends up on the side of the British, and Batman ends up on the side of the rebels. Okay, or Batman and Robin get hypnotized and travel back in time to the days of the frontier with cowboys and Indians, kind of thing. And Batman is dressed up with a Batman headdress or whatever. Right. Or there's the rainbow uniform Batman and the Mountie Batman and Batman of the Planet of the Apes or whatever. And that to me was the hook. With the Marvel comics that Stan wrote, sure, the Hulk would fight the Abomination, or Spider-Man would fight the Rhino, or whatever, and that was all well and good. But what hooked me wasn't the plot, but what was going on with the characters.
Right.
The soap opera elements, the psychological aspects, and all that, and that's what Stan brought to the comics. And so, yeah, Stan did think that comics were very, very sort of generic and boring, and they were great for little kids,
right?
But he was trying to be a little bit more sophisticated, and that was what he brought, and that was something that he innovated. And so he made the characters more flawed. He made the characters more complex. He made them more relatable, where they did make mistakes. They weren't always 100% right or 100% perfect. They had personalities. And he said this a million times over the years. He started writing the kinds of comics that he wanted to read.
Right. Yeah, and you can't undersell that because of the fruits of his labor were clear to see relatively quickly. I mean, you've got he started going on college tours and talk. The level of fan mail that was coming in was from people who you normally would not have thought of at that time to be the regular readers of comic books. It just was, other than your Roy Thomas who you mentioned, or super fans, Rich Morrissey, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it wasn't thought of as a thing that you carried on. In fact, I mean, this, and I can speak to this. Even into the 90s, the idea of a grown-up reading comic books was perceived as sort of a sign of being stunted in some way. It was like, right? I mean,
yeah.
I got to tell you. I look now and I'm like, I see all these girls wearing these like comic book T-shirts and stuff. I'm like, where was this when I was in high school?
Right. Oh, no, I was a complete outsider, a complete outcast. I mean, what's that line from 16 Candles? I was like, king of the dipshits. I was in a very, I mean, that was that. You ever see that movie, 16 Candles?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was basically me and the other guys, like wearing our members-only jackets, standing on the sideline while everybody else was, making out or dancing, the comic book contingent. No, I mean, Stan was brilliant. Stan was brilliant because he made himself the face of Marvel.
Yeah.
And he made himself inextricably linked to Marvel, going on those college tours and speaking to the college kids and putting a name and a face and a voice to the company. Now, people have used that as their ammunition to say that he was a glory hog and he cut Kirby and Ditko out of the loop and all that. But I would say that by doing that, he really put Marvel on the map, gave Marvel its soul and its lifeblood and its personality. And quite frankly, first of all, neither Ditko nor Kirby had that kind of personality that could go out there and really win crowds over. My understanding is that Jack Kirby was a very, very nice man. I met him once when I was 12 years old. He was very kind to me. But Stan is just Stan, I mean, there's just no comparison. And it wasn't just the college tours, and it wasn't just, the great stories and that he wrote. It was the bullpen bulletins page. It was the letters pages where he talked to you like you were a pal of his, Well,
and Glenn, I mean, it was every book you opened it, and the first thing it said was Stan Lee Presents.
Stan Lee Presents. Yeah. Yep. And that carried on even after he was no longer actively involved with the comic book end of the company.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to overstate that. I mean, I remember being a kid and reading the books, and you see his name, and I didn't know what he looked like or whatever. I'm like, who is this guy? Mm-hmm. Who is this mysterious Stan Lee? And then you watch the cartoon, and you hear he narrated the Hulk cartoon show from the 80s.
You jumped the gun because I was just about to say that for me, I don't know about anybody else, but I could say that for me, it was a thrill when they announced that. I guess it was the Amazing Spider-Man, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and the Incredible Hulk cartoons. They advertised it as narrated by Stan the Man Lee, and Stan even wrote in a bullpen bulletins page, if you ever wanted to hear what I sound like, tune in. And for me, it was a thrill finally getting to hear his voice for the first time.
Yep. So that's my exact
exciting.
Experience. Yeah.
Yeah, this was 1982, So I must have been around 12 or 13, and I was so excited to finally hear what he. I knew what he looked like, of course, because he put himself in those. Uncle Stan wants you to subscribe to Marvel Comics. So I knew what he looked like, but I never heard his voice. So yeah, it was a big thrill, and I understand why Kirby and Ditko felt slighted, and I understand the position that Stan's detractors have taken over the years. But I think that in building up the Kirby-Ditko side, I feel like they've unfairly diminished the Stan side. And, you can criticize Stan for maybe taking more credit than he deserves, but to say that he deserves no credit is that's just a notion that I reject completely.
Well, and certainly the idea that he ever denied the role that his collaborators played, because there's plenty of interviews, and it's out there as part of the record where he says, I asked Jack do this, and Steve brought me this, and Jack drew this guy. I said, who is that? He said, oh, that's the Herald of Galactus. You know what I mean? It's all out there. This is you mentioned Bob Kane before. The thing with Bob Kane that's just infuriating. I don't mean this to go down that road, but it really it boggles my mind. To me, what he did, I can only boil it down to pure maliciousness, because he knew exactly what he did, and it was to rob his co-creator of any credit for this thing. That it's stupefying. You know what I mean? Like I'm like, how does somebody with a conscience do that?
When he wrote that letter in 1965 or 66, when the word leaked out that Bill Finger was just as responsible for the creation of Batman, if not more so, and Bob Kane wrote this scathing letter to the magazine that the fanzine that published the I guess it was an interview with Bill Finger, and Bob Kane wrote this long diatribe where he portrayed Bill Finger as little more than the guy who sharpened his pencils. And it was just so disgusting knowing what the real story was. Stan never did that. There's an interview with Stan where he gave Ditko almost all of the credit for the creation of Doctor Strange, because Stan had doubts that Doctor Strange was ever going to succeed. He said, well, Steve came to me with this new character. It's called Doctor Strange. It's mostly Steve. I don't know if it's going to fly, but, you never know. And so he gave credit. Sure, in later years, maybe he didn't give as much credit as some people would have liked. He certainly didn't fawn over, he certainly didn't bend over backwards to spread the wealth around, so to speak. But, in his mind, and I remember an interview, I think it was with Kurt Busiek, where Kurt had been talking to Stan, and Stan had said that in Hollywood, if you just come up with a concept, like, I'm just using an example, MTV Cops, if you're the producer. Now, in real life, it was Brandon Tartikoff who came up with that idea that became Miami Vice. He couldn't get a creator credit. But if it was somebody else who came to, who was an executive at NBC or a producer at NBC and said, MTV Cops, these two guys with a lot of pastels and, they solve drug crimes and all that, and Miami Vice. And that's that person's only contribution, they get listed as the creator. If they bring in somebody else who fleshes out the characters, they come up with the names, they come up with all of the particulars, the guy who came up with the concept MTV Cops, that's the creator. And Stan felt that was enough.
Right.
Stan said, in Hollywood, I would be considered the sole creator of all this stuff, not even the co-creator.
Yeah.
And so that was his mindset. It's hard to say who's right and who's wrong. But all else, it takes me back to what I said at the beginning. Even if Stan was just the editor on those books, he was the greatest editor that Marvel ever had.
Right. Well, and
the fact of the
sorry, just picking up on what you're saying. this is not a conversation that's exclusive to this idea of Stan Lee and whether he should get credit or Jack Kirby, et cetera. Because we see, I mean, I've seen Rob Liefeld say, because he's co-credited with Louis Simonson for Deadpool and for Cable, and he's like, I should be
over Cable.
Over Cable specifically, not Deadpool.
Fabian Nicieza is the co-creator of Deadpool.
That's right. For Cable, yeah, he's like, I came in with it already. I should be, and I mean, I'm a total outsider here, but I mean, this stuff, it's silky, right? That's the thing. I know David Michelinie has said, technically, I created Venom. It wasn't McFarlane, but arguably McFarlane is added this, and Eric Larson added this, and you look at the movie that just came out, and you can point to 6 different creators who added sort of these things that we now consider iconic, right? So it's it's messy. The creative process, it's messy. Stuff gets everywhere,
Right. On the same token, we know we have seen the plot that Stan wrote for the first issue of the Fantastic Four.
That's right.
It's out there. You can't take that away from him. He sat down and typed that up. And so, sure, Jack fleshed it out, but Stan was there. Stan sat down and wrote it. And the only reason why he wasn't writing detailed plots for every comic book was because he had about 3 other jobs.
And he had collaborators who he knew could do the job.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
I mean, and that's the fascinating thing because I often will go back and flip through, I have the big omnibus editions of the Silver Age stuff, and if you look at the way Stan wrote for Kirby, it's different than the way he wrote for Ditko. They each brought out it's this amazing symbiosis. His Spider-Man and Doctor Strange read a certain way when you compare it to like his Fantastic Four or Captain America.
Right, and a couple of other points. One is that you read Fantastic Four by Lee and Kirby. Or Thor by Lee and Kirby, and then you read The New Gods by just Kirby, and you can see the difference. You can see what Stan brought to the table, for sure.
Yeah.
And just the other thing in terms of Stan giving credit where credit is due. I've been reading the early Daredevils, and there was an issue that I guess it was Wally Wood plotted it, and Stan made such a big deal in the credits that Stan, Wally didn't just draw this book; he came up with the plot too, kind of thing.
Right.
And it's like he made a point of it. And me reading it like 50 years later, it's like, wow. I mean, he's really bending over backwards to give credit to the guy.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what went on behind the scenes to lead Stan to do that, but he did it.
Yeah.
He gave the credit at a time when DC was still not publishing, the names of the people who were doing the books.
Right.
So I think, a lot of people just want to be crusaders and they want to fight for, the underdog, or they want to, try to correct, right wrongs that they feel were, Kirby was no angel either in that. I mean, he took a ridiculous amount of credit. There's that infamous Comics Journal interview that he did.
Yeah.
Around 1992, I think it was, or maybe a little bit earlier, where he took credit for every single thing, including Spider-Man.
Including Spider-Man, yeah.
So, there is that whole Lennon-McCartney thing. It's hard to nail down, who did what. In recent years, obviously, Paul has made it clear which songs he feels the strongest about that he wrote on his own.
Right.
So eventually, no one's immune from wanting their proper share of the credit and so forth. But the funny thing is, both Lennon and McCartney separately did interviews where they went through all the Beatles songs and explained who did what. And only in maybe 1 or 2 cases out of all the songs that have their byline together did they part company.
Really?
So that's pretty good. Yeah, I think Eleanor Rigby, for some very strange reason, John claimed he wrote it. which is bizarre. I mean, I like to think maybe he was joking around, but I think as I recall, he claimed credit for Eleanor Rigby, and he claimed sole credit for In My Life, but Paul helped him out on that, supposedly. So those are the only two instances where they disagreed. But with Lee and Kirby, I mean, Stan went to his grave not completely understanding why Kirby and Ditko turned on him. I don't think he ever fully really, even though it had been explained to him many times over the years, I don't think he ever fully accepted it or grasped it.
I think what it comes down to some extent is that if you're Jack Kirby, or if you're Steve Ditko and you're working in the Marvel method is do something here. Have a story where this happens and this, and whatever you want to add, just figure it out. Okay, here's Jack Kirby. He spends however many days and nights slaving over the board, turning in the what will be the next issue. Right. So in other words, he's mapped out the story. Mm-hmm. And then here's Stan, who looks at it and says, all right, let's have so-and-so say this. Let's have this dialogue allude to this. The picture doesn't depict this, but maybe let's have somebody say this, right? So in Stan's mind, he's threading the story together. Mm-hmm. But in Kirby's mind, he's like, well, I already did it.
Right.
Right? So it's, how do you define writer? And that's the loggerheads we're at. So Stan Lee's like, well, I gave him the plot and I wrote the words. And Jack Kirby's like, well, I took his sentence and turned it into 20 pages.
Right.
So they're both right from a certain point of view.
Exactly. But, there's that whole Fantastic Four story where they introduced the creature that would eventually become Adam Warlock. And Kirby had something very specific in mind. And Stan had another. Stan saw the pages and he didn't like the direction that Kirby was going, and he changed the story fundamentally.
Right.
So then who gets the credit at that point? I mean, you have to sort of like not acknowledge that one as a real co-creation, because Kirby was going one way, Stan was going another. The story got published eventually, but. Who's the writer? You have to give it to both of them.
Yeah.
There was the last issue of FF that Kirby worked on. It was published out of sequence because Stan pulled it from the rotation. He had it substantially reworked, and it came out the same month that the New Gods premiered, because Stan very cleverly said, "Well, let's have Kirby compete against himself." And so, but it was. I think it was the issue with this character called Janice. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Only vaguely.
Okay. Stan had it substantially reworked because he didn't like the story, or he didn't like how Kirby executed it. So it's not like Stan was just like this rubber stamp who basically just filled in the blanks that Kirby left behind him. Basically took Kirby's notes and turned them into complete sentences. He did more than that. He did a lot more than that.
Right.
And
yeah, you're right. By the way, Janice, the Nega Man.
Yeah. Right. All right. So he did exert editorial control when he felt it was necessary.
Well, I mean,
that's the job of an editor.
And I think you're right. And I think that if anything, just this conversation we've been having for the better part of the last hour just shows really that, I mean, they say that in Hollywood, but I would expand it to any creative field. Success has many fathers, but failure's an orphan. The mere fact that there is this question of who deserves credit, who doesn't, it says something to just what a large footprint that he is leaving behind. I just out of curiosity, I went to Box Office Mojo here and I picked up the biggest opening weekends of all time. So the top opening weekends of all time. And look at this. Number 1, Avengers Infinity War. Number 5, The Avengers. Number 6, Black Panther. Number 7, Age of Ultron. Number 9, Captain America Civil War. Number 11, Iron Man 3. Number 19, Spider-Man 3. This is amazing. There's one man who is able to link all of those together. Stan Lee gets a pretty big share of the credit for that. It's amazing. It's amazing how you go from 1962 to now. He was right. I mean, he was so far ahead of everyone else. He was the one saying, you know what, there's something here. There's something here. And now we live in an age where everyone knows who the Avengers are. You can point to Black Panther, and that's a movie that's in serious contention for Best Picture. That was Stan Lee way back in the day saying, we need a black superhero. I mean, think about everything that he played a role in. It's what a life, what a legend, what a legacy.
The only thing I can add to that is, there's that famous line from Star Trek 2 at the very end where McCoy says, he's not really dead as long as we remember him. And Stan Lee will never truly be gone because he will live on in his work, his name, and the thousands and thousands of characters and stories that he has had a hand in bringing to this world that will continue on for years and years and years to come. People will remember him. He will be up there with Walt Disney, Gene Roddenberry, George Lucas, as a king of imagination, a genius of imagination, someone who has helped shape millions of childhoods and inspired so many of the creative leaders that we have in the world today and will continue to have.
The only thing I can add to that, Glenn, is once we get to that first Marvel movie without the Stan Lee cameo, it's going to wreck me, dude.
Oh, boy, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I almost wish that the last one we saw him in was the one from the Guardians of the Galaxy where he was,
oh,
he was hanging out with the Watchers. What a perfect way that would have been
tie it all together.
To go out. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that he had already shot several of his. I don't know how far into the future, but he had said in the past that Spidey is his favorite creation, and so if Spider-Man Far From Home should end up being his last cameo, well, there is a certain amount of perfect Marvel-style symmetry there.
Yeah, definitely. I wish he could have lived to see a really great Fantastic Four movie, and one featuring the Silver Surfer, because that, along with Spider-Man, that was his favorite Marvel character.
Right. Well, and as we wrap things up here, I mean, I think that your summation of the man and just the reach that he will continue to have for time immemorial, as long as people are consuming and enjoying stories, Stan Lee's impact will be felt. I don't think that that's too big of a statement to make. I truly don't.
It's not. It's very apt, very, very appropriate, and very accurate. He's truly somebody that will live on, for generations to come, through his work and just through his persona.
Well, that's a perfect place to end it. And Stan, I know you're out there somewhere, and all I can say to you is the same thing you've said to me so many times: Excelsior.
And I'm just going to add, enough said.
Enough said. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this very special episode of Nostalgia Theater. And thank you so much to my good friend Glenn for joining me here. I couldn't have asked for a better person to pour a 40 out for Stan the Man with.
Thanks for inviting me, Zachy.
And folks, we'll be back in our next episode with another fun topic, and hopefully Glenn will be back in just a few short weeks with our commentary track for Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. And if you have any questions or comments, please send them to me, moviefilmpodcast@gmail.com. You can also hit like on our Facebook page, facebook.com/moviefilmpodcast. Also, find me on Twitter at Zacky's Corner, that's ZAKIS Corner. It's also my website, just add.com. And Glenn, I know that you maintain a social media presence. Anything you want to let people know about?
Twitter is at Glenn L. Greenberg. 2 N's in Glenn.
Well, there we go. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll catch you next time.
I guess one person can make a difference. Enough said.